to a webinar on disaster risk funding that we are doing here from WACOS in partnership with the State Emergency Management Committee. My name is Carol, and I will be facilitating this webinar, and then we have a series of amazing presenters for you. So welcome. Yes, so before we get into it, I just want to acknowledge that we are on Whātua Noa land, the traditional custodians of this land. And in light of the referendum, we really do just grieve the lack of voice that's been given to Indigenous people. We just want to recognize the traditional owners of this country throughout Western Australia, paying our respects to elders, both past and present. And we do encourage you to share which Aboriginal lands you're on today in the chat. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all today and to welcome our speakers as well. We have a series of really great speakers for you. So we'll be starting with Matt Fogg, who's joining us from CMAC, and he's going to give you an overview of disaster ready funding. And then we'll be moving on to Leela James, who will be presenting the Sendai framework, defining disaster risk reduction in this application process. And then we have Claire Ghibolini joining us on disaster inclusion of the disaster risk reduction space. And lastly, we'll have a presentation from Tara Whitney on grant writing and some tips to go through that as well. So that's the loose agenda for today. Some house stuff before we get into the real presentations is just that thank you. We will have all of you on mute. We do have a question period that's coming up after the presentation on disaster inclusion or disability inclusion. So do just save up your questions or put them in the chat. We'll be fielding that as well. And then lastly, there also is a small change in agenda. So we'll be going first to Matt and Leela, if you did see that agenda as well. And lastly, for all of you to know, the recording will be posted. So if you prefer to have your video off, just feel free to do that. Yes, also we can pass on that recording afterwards as well to any colleagues interested, etc. Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. We have Matthew Fogg presenting first on disaster ready fund process, and that's going to be followed immediately by Leela James. And they are both joining us from CMAC, where Matt serves as the executive manager of the CMAC committee through the Department of Fire and Services and Emergency Services. He brings 15 years of experience in state government. And Leela is also joining us from CMAC, where she's the newly appointed Senior Quality Assurance Officer, and she'll be supporting applications for this funding. She also, as many of you know, has a lot of experience in the community sector and has spent lots of time working here at WACOS too. So we're excited to welcome her into this presentation. And I'll pass it over to them to share their slides. And yes, feel free to throw any questions into the chat while they're going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol, and also thank you to WACOS for hosting today. I just want to recognise that we are on Noongar land today, but I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which everyone else is meeting from as well. And I'll pay my respects to the elders past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So disaster ready fund, I think some of the people in this room might be across from previous rounds. So I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. Perfect. So yes, we are from the State Emergency Management Committee. So I'm Matthew Fogg. To my left is Leela James, who some of you may be familiar with from her time within the sector. And we're just going to talk you through today around who we are, what we do, and how we are here to help you hopefully get some funding if you choose to go down this avenue. So the State Emergency Management Committee has a strategic advisory role in relation to EM in WA. And the business unit, which I head up, is supported by DFES, but we provide facilitation and coordination for that committee. And as a part of that, we play a key role in the administration and coordination of grant programs across the EM sector. So in addition, with the Disaster Ready Fund, we also handle the National Disaster Risk Reduction Grant Program as well. And I'm also happy to give a quick update on that one. With the State Emergency Management Committee meeting at its last meeting has endorsed an allocation of $1.5 million to support the impending release of the community disaster resilience strategy as well. So we do have some other funding avenues coming up as well, which Leela will be happy to coordinate if you get in touch with Leela. So, but we haven't announced that yet, so that's just a little bit of a preemptive heads up that is likely coming down the pipeline as well. So moving on to what is the Disaster Ready Fund? So this is a Commonwealth grant program that's administered by the National Emergency Management Agency, and it's really focusing on resilience and risk reduction. So it's heavily in that prevention and preparedness space. So it's $1 billion over 5 years to deliver locally driven projects, and that's $200 million per year. There is a bit of a catch in it, which I think everyone experiences, and that's the 50% co-contribution, but Leela will touch on that a little bit later. So round one closed in March 2023. Out of that, Western Australia only got about 8.8 million, and that was over 23 projects. And I think there was a bit of a gap in the money awarded between infrastructure projects and community-based organisations, and we're hoping to close that gap as we head into round two. And I think NEMA is certainly aware that that's how round one panned out. So we're expecting round two to open in January. I don't think it's going to be ready in time for December. I'm expecting early January, and probably with a close possibly at the end of March, based on, I know the slide says April, but we've received some further indications it may close end of March. So with that being said, that's quite a challenging time of year for everyone, particularly if we do have a major incident and we're required to go into recovery and start helping people. So our intention from this office is to start working with people early and start getting them through the process. And then also looking for areas and ways that we can provide assistance in helping those applications put their best foot forward, particularly when it comes around problem statements and identifying data that will support applications. So the Disaster Ready Fund goes for natural hazards, so flood, bushfire, cyclone, earthquake, tsunami, storm, and heat wave. So any applications we receive need to be addressing the natural hazards, otherwise they will not get approved. So what do we mean by natural hazards? So they trigger disasters that impact what we value. So that can be the built environment or infrastructure assets. It can be our social environment, which is looking at networks, relationships, cultural practices, well-being, also essential services such as health, education, and lifestyle. The natural environment, which will be there as well, then also the economic environment. But I really think we're looking at that social environment through this webinar today. So based on a round one analysis, there were 187 projects approved nationally, of which 11 projects were valued over $12 million, which involved not-for-profits and charities as delivery partners. And I think one of the big ones to flag here is that the guidelines will refer to a co-contribution waiver. Our analysis on round one, and also just reading the vibe coming out of NEMA, is that co-contribution waiver would generally be looking at remote and disadvantaged communities. So if we're thinking a lot of the remote communities up in the Kimberley and the Pilbara, and also out in the eastern parts of the states, I think that's what they're trying to capture with that. However, if you've got a project which you feel may or may not be eligible for a waiver, I'm happy to have a conversation and we can kind of figure out whether or not it would be worthwhile putting in an application or not. Because the last thing that we want to see is people putting the time and effort into an application when it's really got an unlikely chance of success because of what I will call vagueness in the guidelines. So out of that distribution, 64 million was out for infrastructure projects, about 83 for risk reduction, and about 51 were kind of a combined approach. So here's some example of some successful projects from round one from around the country, just so you can kind of see what other people got money for. So we've got good projects there to do with young people and disasters. Disability did quite well. Community engagement programs such as Regional Disaster Ready in Queensland, and also in the ACT with the Community Engagement, Education and Preparedness Project. Disaster Resilience and Climate Justice in Community Services, that was a WA-based application which did well. a mobile care centre in South Australia, also food relief, and also but up in South Australia and also the Northern Territory, which I think is a pretty good indication that any project regarding food relief may be favourably received. And then also supporting people at increased risk to prepare for natural hazards on other community engagement piece also did quite well. So moving on to the round 2 investment considerations. So most of this has been touched on by NEMA in other public forums. However, I don't think the information has been put out there quite as broadly as it could have been. So we're looking for risk-informed applications. So we need to draw on evidence of disaster risk. It needs to be aligned with existing state, national and territory hazard mitigation and resilience plans. So if we think about some of the work that the Department of Communities are doing in this space, and then also SEMC documentation as well to kind of support any applications from a strategic level. Approximately 6 weeks ago, NEMA released the second National Action Plan. They will be incentivising projects that can demonstrate a linkage back to that plan favourably. That plan has 24 different action areas. So I think that's, if we can build a strong narrative linking that back in, I think that's critical for success. And I'd probably suggest that if you don't refer to the second National Action Plan in your application, it's probably putting you on weak ground to move forward. And also diverse and equitable outcomes. We're unsure how this would be administered yet. However, I think from the round 1 analysis, they kind of realised that a lot of the projects were centric to CBD areas. And so I think they're looking at how they can break that down at a more equitable level, and particularly covering off larger portions of Australia than just the metropolitan centres. So moving into the second National Action Plan. So I think when we talk about the second National Action Plan, there's a lot of related actions for the sector. So I've just put them up on the page now. But really we're looking at risk mitigation plans to support that shared understanding within the community, community decision making as well, and strengthening the capability and capacity of individuals and communities to become leaders and really make more informed risk reduction decisions. They're looking to facilitate greater EM sector professionalism, capability and participation, including the volunteer sector as well. And also creating spaces and opportunities for inclusive and diverse community participation in EM. So there's quite a few things that when we look at the second National Action Plan, that we could bring into applications from within the sector. And as you can probably see, they are quite broad as well. So I think building the argument, if you sharpen your pencils, I think you can probably manage to do that quite easily. But I think it's going to be putting more information in the second National Action Plan as opposed to less. But we will send out a copy of these slides as well after the webinar, and you can kind of see which ones we think that we're looking at. So just going through and other areas where we get that strategic alignment. So the DRF seeks to support the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. So within there, we have 11 priority action areas under the WA implementation plan. So any of the areas such as community focused resilience, which is the number 1 outcome, if you can link that back in your application, that would also be viewed favourably by NEMA. And then just having a look at some emerging themes which may help. So looking to build social capital, and also building on social service capacity and emergency relief and support. One of the big things NEMA is looking at the moment is alternatives to the ADF and expanding the volunteer base. And I think everyone's experience is that when an incident happens, the incident may last 2 weeks, but the recovery lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So we need to be looking at that. Service provider emergency preparedness as well. So looking at business continuity planning for our service providers, and also the ability to maintain services to clients during and after emergencies. Looking at vulnerable cohorts and people that enhance risk in emergencies. So planning and preparedness, response and recovery practices. but also rollout of PCEP type planning as well. Enhancing wellbeing to support regional WA. So just noting as well, the National Disaster Mental Health and Wellbeing Framework was also released earlier this year by the Commonwealth Government. I think if we have any strategic linkages back to that document, that would be viewed very favourably. Looking to increase response capability of remote Aboriginal communities and cold preparedness. So if we can look at addressing closing the gap, things like that, that would be very well received. And just noting as well that with the remote Aboriginal community projects, they will likely be viewed favourably for a co-contribution waiver as well. Looking at emergency accommodation options, particularly in the regional areas, I think there's been a lot learned out of the Kimberley floods, where we've had significant challenges in response to that incident. So any lessons learned, I think, would build a strong business case. And also data sharing processes as well. So looking for efficient and effective ways to share data to enhance the relief and support function which we undertake. So what I'll do now that's just some rough ideas on where NEMA may be looking, I'll hand over to Leela, who's going to discuss some of the key challenges for the sector in achieving this grant. But I think if getting in early and getting applications under development, I think that's probably the key to success. So handing over to you, Leela.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm just going to put a timer on because I've got 20 minutes, and those who know me know that I can speak underwater for much longer. Can I please just start by acknowledging the traditional owners across Western Australia, recognising that First Nations people bring inherent knowledge and contribution to disaster risk reduction and emergency management. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so, I think Matt touched very broadly on some of the topics I'm going to talk about, but often previously when I sat in webinars like this, I heard what was said and I had a broad understanding, but I didn't really understand what that translates to. I'm hoping to add value to your knowledge of disaster risk reduction and the key data and analysis sources that you might go to in pursuing an application. And now, conversation around soft and hard projects. This is important because I'm sure many of you can recognise that looking back over the last couple of 100 years, there has been a priority and a focus on hard infrastructure. How do we protect buildings, economies, bush, people, of course. We do that with fire trucks and air bombers, and that's where a lot of the funding has gone. Although what we're seeing now is a greater priority in actually funding to reduce the risks associated with people, place, community, culture. And I think that while it's a new emerging area, that the sector is in a really great place to be applying and promoting those priorities. Of course, the 50% co-contribution is a massive thorn in our side, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. The time frames, we know that quite often, no matter who the grant provider is, we end up with them opening quickly and then closing too fast. And as Matt said, we really want to support robust applications to be ready to go in when it opens. And that just gives us a little bit of room in case we get feedback and we can, make an adjustment to an application or get it over the line, or provides us with more time to support other applicants. So we're really encouraging you to think about starting these applications now. And then, of course, it can be a challenge writing grants in any circumstance, but the disaster risk reduction context is for a lot of people a new context with new language. Sometimes we have overlapping language between the sector and the EM sector, but yet they mean different things. So we're here to support that process. And I think the biggest challenge that I certainly experienced, and I know that a lot of my colleagues have, is really understanding what defines disaster risk and what evidence and analysis would we use to evidence that throughout the application. And so, of course, I'm really hoping to be able to add value to that knowledge today. Could you click next slide? Okay, so disaster risk. And as we go through this, like for example, with this slide, I'd be really keen if you're familiar with this, if you gave us a thumbs up. I'm just really curious to gauge where everybody's at with knowledge. Okay, so the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Body defines risk as the likelihood of a hazard event, bushfire, flood, cyclone, the exposure of that impact area. And exposure can be about population density, it can be the quality of housing, it could be the quality of infrastructure. And then we want to look at how vulnerable are those things that we value that are being impacted by the hazard. And so this is really your the sector's bread and butter. We know vulnerability. We know that people in remote communities are too often likely to live in substandard housing, and that's going to make them living through high heat a greater risk. So being able to determine the hazard, the exposure and the vulnerability, and that will give you a good definition of the disaster risk and the problem statement, which often you may hear the term problem statement, but we're talking about the disaster risk that your application aims to reduce. And next slide. Oh, sorry, there we go. Okay. And then, of course, how we manage these, the disaster risk is about resilience. And I know that through my experience within this sector, resilience can mean different things to different sectors and to different bodies. However, this definition is pulled from the WA Emergency Management Glossary. And there are some different words used to describe key components of disaster risk reduction and emergency management. So I would encourage you all to have a look at that glossary, because as you're writing these applications, you want to use the emergency management glossary to ensure that you're getting the definitions correctly across. It's important also to recognise that in WA we have 6 risk categories, and we will make sure you get the slides with these notes, but they are people, economy, infrastructure, social, public administration and environmental. And so, your applications will be framed by these risk categories. And you can see that if you're working in developing risk understanding and preparedness plans for people who live with disproportionate risk, you would be looking at the people. However, if you're looking at also, ensuring that their jobs and their financial security is protected, then that, would also map across to economy as well. And here I just wanted to give you a bit of a slide on what community disaster resilience looks like, and I'm sure that each of these little icons will mean something to the sector, because again, I feel like it's largely the sector's bread and butter. Now, I did also want to introduce you to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. I'm curious how many of you are familiar, you might know of it, but have many of you had an opportunity to understand and think about how this framework is the blueprint for how we prepare for the changing climate ahead? That's great, Colina. Awesome. So what is the Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework? So this global agreement from 2015 was actually initiated to protect the gains we have made and hope to continue to make of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because, over the last 20, 30 years, we have managed to make some gains on those development goals, but our changing climate and our increasing disaster risk threatens those gains. So this was a global agreement. And you can see the outcome is the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihood, health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental and assets of people, businesses, and communities. So it's broad, and it's really protecting our those things within our society and our systems that we value. I won't go through all of these because you will be able to have a deeper dive, but the goal is broadly to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk. What's important here is if you see these 4 priorities: understanding disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction, strengthening risk governance, and enhancing preparedness, you will see that these 4 priorities can be mapped over our National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework and the second National Action Plan. And in fact, you will see that they can be mapped over our state priorities. So Sendai is, like I said, that guiding blueprint that's setting the global agenda on how to reduce disaster risk and the consequence of those risks. And then, of course, we can see that we've got the 7 targets. And again, our national and state targets and priorities will map across to this. So there is that integration across the globe down to our state. And indeed, you know, if you look at different action plans of your local government, or some other agencies in your region or local area, you'll see those mapped across there as well. Okay, so this is just a quick look at the guiding principles of Sendai. I think that these are really important because while we see these as, you know, pitched at a global level, we can also see how these priorities and principles will inform our own work and our own applications, because we will want to ensure that if we have, as a sector and as people, a shared responsibility, then we are supported to develop the capability and capacity to contribute to that shared responsibility. Of course, when we're talking about engagement, we know that if we want to protect people who are at most risk, we need to include them in the conversation at every level around emergency management and disaster risk reduction. We also want to ensure that all disaster risk reduction activities are designed and delivered in a way that is going to build community capacity and capability and take a human rights approach. No DRR activity should erode gains or assets that are made and enjoyed. And then, of course, we have the partnership principles, and while it's looking at a global level, we wanted that partnership is important for us in our applications as well. We need to know what other agencies might be planning an application that can coincide with ours, and if there is one, then we want to be able to integrate that or demonstrate that we've been having those conversations. I also read some literature to say that in this round, it's quite likely that they'll be looking for evidence of engagement. And this will be really relevant for our sector because a lot of the work that we do, or that you do, I should say, is on behalf and with people who are disproportionately at risk. And so if you're developing an application for people with disabilities, they're going to want to see evidence that you've consulted with and partnered with and really heard the voice of people with disabilities. Okay, so now we're thinking about how we're going to define the risk and where are we going to get the evidence. Now, Matt's already touched on your first point of call really should be those guiding national frameworks and strategies. So the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, more importantly, the second National Action Plan. So that's only just come out this year. So you want to go and make sure that what your project proposes to do is going to speak to these priorities. And then, of course, at a state level, the state will want to see how your project is going to build state capacity or to reduce that risk. Then we're also going to want to evidence what the potential risk is on those 6 priority areas, the ones that are relevant to you. So, for example, if you're proposing a project to build disaster risk preparedness within the multicultural sector, we need the data to say that multicultural communities are more at risk in hazard events. And again, you know, if you are struggling to find that data, we can assist you because that data certainly does exist and it would make a great project. And then next, we will need to demonstrate the potential impact that the disaster risk that you're addressing will have. And this, you know, that the activities that you're proposing will lead to the outcomes that is defined by the funding by the DRF. And of course, your organization and your sector will have data to evidence, you know, that vulnerability side of your project. What makes, why is it that multicultural communities are more at risk in a hazard? And what are the evidence-based solutions to reducing that risk? And then we also want to see, and you know, we know that the applications need to align to those, you know, key frameworks at a national and state level. However, if your application, for example, is focused on building capacity on people with disabilities, you might want to reference and map how your project outputs and outcomes contribute to the WA state disability strategy. And it doesn't necessarily need to be very extensive, but the assessors are going to see that not only is your project going to meet the outcomes defined by the program, but it is going to contribute to state priorities in a broader sense. And another really good example of that is that the National Close the Gap Agreement has targets for the inclusion of Aboriginal people in emergency management. And that target is included in the WA Close the Gap implementation plan. So if your project was going to be speaking to the inclusion of First Nations people, then that would be another state strategy to reference. I'd also suggest that there's parliamentary inquiries and recommendations that may be relevant. I'm not suggesting that all of this will apply to every project. These are just some broad ideas around where we might go to find the evidence and data to strengthen our application. And again, so we're looking at the development of a project application and the types of narrative and data that your application will be speaking to. Of course, we need to evidence our disaster risk, recognising that the northwest is prone to cyclones probably won't be enough. We're going to need to actually go in and say, we have, you know, this current level of risk, and in 15, 20 years, that's going to increase by 30%. And then, of course, that exposure risk is that, you know, we've got really vulnerable supply lines and essential services up there, and that's evidenced by, you know, by this. And then, of course, we have vulnerability. We have a population that's living below the poverty line. Our project's going to align to all of these different strategies. And here is how we know that our activities will reduce that risk. And here is the outcomes that the project will have measured against the DRF priorities and the state implementation plan. We know that the next round of applications is going to call for a program logic. I know that the sector is, you know, really down with program logics. There is thought that perhaps NEMA is going to actually release a template for the application. However, I would suggest that we don't wait for them to release anything, and we use a template that we have within our organisation. Or we could, you know, duplicate this one. I'm looking to see if there's a way to make this writable, because I couldn't work it out. But if this does be editable, we're happy to make that available. But we would say that whatever work you can get started on your application now would be a great idea, because often we don't get the time we need through these funding rounds. And finally, we just, you know, wanted to ensure that everybody understands that we're really here to support applications. We would encourage you to jump onto the SEM website and have a look at the EOI. Send, you know, put any ideas into that EOI, and that just helps us start triaging those EOIs. However, if you're really stuck, just reach out and we will support you in your thinking.
Fantastic, thank you, Leila. And I think just focusing on how we are here to help, we're really ramping up in this section. So some of the benefits of filling out that EOI as well is we're able to assist really in that problem definition, which Leila's just spoken about, and provide assistance in developing that strong narrative that you'll need to get funding over the line. And the other thing that we're making available to the sector is Tara Whitney, who will be speaking later today, and from Whitney Consulting, has been engaged by the SENC business unit to undertake grant reviews as well. So there is an opportunity there for your applications to have a professional grant review prior to submitting. So that way we can identify any gaps or any areas where we can strengthen applications by someone who can provide that professional service. We're also looking to link organisations up with government agencies as well in obtaining letters of support, and then also looking for any synergies between various projects where they might be able to feed off each other and perhaps share co-contributions and things like that as well. So look, I think there's a lot of benefit in getting in contact with us early. We are willing to help the sector. And we do have a lot of support services to provide in terms of getting these applications developed and through to NEMA. So that's the end of our presentation. But if you have any questions, please contact senc.grants@dfs.gov.au or Leila directly as well. Handing back to you, Carol.
Thank you both so much. That was so useful. And yes, please also feel free to put any questions in the chat. I suppose one quick one before we jump to Claire is expressions of interest. When's the closing date for that people can mark down?
The website currently says November 15. We will be removing that date and it will be an open expression of interest. So we note that we're only in round 2 now. There's 3 more rounds to go after that. The intent is to have this as a 365 program. So we'll have the expression of interest open early. And what that will allow us to do is not only handle the disaster ready fund expression of interest as well, but more broadly as well, anything that we have going with any other grant programs which come through or funding opportunities as well. So if we're aware of projects that are out there in the sector, if a funding opportunity comes available where we are aware of, we can get in touch and have a chat about it.
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you both so much. Wonderful. Well, we'll now pass it on to Claire, who's joining us here in person. And just to introduce her as well, she's an amazing advocate for disability inclusion and disaster preparedness. She serves as co-chair for the Oversight Council for the National Autism Strategy. She's a member of the Ministerial Advisory Council on Disability and a stakeholder and partnership leads at Values Lives and volunteers with multiple groups. Almost too many to name, so.
Yeah, I've got a lot of hats. Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here and see so many people that are interested. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and acknowledge the ongoing trauma from the referendum, and just acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So yeah, I do have I'm pressing buttons on a computer that's actually not connected to the screen. I don't know what I'm doing today. So yes, I am a person. I have multiple disabilities. I am all of the things that have been listed. I'm also actually a lived experience co-researcher with the University of Sydney who are working on the PCEP project. So the PCEP, person-centered emergency planning for, what started out with people with disability, but actually really suits a lot of cohorts of people that are at greater risk. And I'm a DFES volunteer, so I am very nervously looking out the window at the wind and keeping an eye on my BART application that is telling me to get prepared for the weekend. So yeah, so there's a lot going on, and I do spend quite a bit of time in WA, but nationally and internationally working on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction and trying to get my community to be prepared, but also as part of the solution. So for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with my community, I wanted to just run a few things through, give you some stats, because I know now that we've heard Matt, stats are good. So I'm going to give you some today. So in Australia, we estimate that we have about 4.5 million people that live with some form of disability. Disability does cover a huge range of conditions that limit someone's ability to do certain activities. Now, the reason I bring this up, and particularly the line on the bottom of the slide, is because often when I work particularly on a national level, I hear, oh, but the NDIS will cover that. Well, there's a couple of things I want to say to that. So the NDIS currently only supports approximately 10% of those 4.4 million people around the country. The other thing that is relevant to the disaster risk space is that whilst, the other 90% might not in their day-to-day lives require any form of support or receive support in other ways, it's when we're facing disasters and emergencies that this is going to become particularly relevant, because that might be, well, it will be the time in which they're going to need additional support, in which that risk intensifies immeasurably. So I suppose that's why I'm so glad to be here today, and thanks to the WACOS team for bringing this into the conversation. So I really, I want to ask and encourage that when you're building your projects, that you take this into account, that there are many people in your community that have disability or support someone that does, that are not going to have the sort of formal supports that we all think that they will be able to rely on. And, they don't need it in their day-to-day lives unless this sorts of stuff happens. So on to the next slide for me. Thanks, Shelby. So here you go. Here's some stats. This comes from, so one of the things I do is work in some of the UN spaces, and this is information that has come from them. So around 71% of people with disability in our country. So whilst I know the UN works across the board, people often say, oh, but that's only in developing nations. Well, actually, no, these stats are just as relevant here in Australia. About 71% of us have no plan for disasters other than call 000, get to an evacuation centre and hope for the best. About 13% of us, though, have no support to evacuate should we need it. And if anybody else here works in the emergency management space or the front line, we know that we actually don't know where those people are. So it's a little bit of a, huge risk. Around 85% of us have actually never been involved in these types of conversations. They're not connected to the local emergency management committees in their local government areas. They don't know who the local firefighters are or where they can go to get support. And only 20% of those people, though, would be capable of evacuating in a sudden disaster. So that's pretty scary stats. You know, we are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured. We face a much higher risk of property loss and long-term displacement from community. Now that comes because we might, takes a very long time to replace equipment that people rely on, so assistive technology. You know, it's often very difficult to find appropriate housing in an area that's been impacted by a disaster. And, you know, I give NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, a really hard time about this all the time, but sometimes policies for recovery are implemented that exclude us. For example, in the Northern Rivers, where people have been receiving funding to elevate their houses, which now cuts a lot of us out of the rental and home ownership market. But we know also that in these situations, we come up hard against what I call the right to be rescued versus the realities of triage, and I forgot to fix that quite a little bit there. But, you know, the reality is, you know, we have a human right to be part of solutions and to be rescued in these situations, but the reality is there are limited resources. And, you know, if everybody's calling on those resources all at once, we do face the reality of triage, which means that's, you know, why we face that top stat around being more likely to die or be injured. But the good news is we actually are also ready to be part of the solution and are often very skilled. So I will come to that in a moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we are disproportionately affected, and if you are familiar with the Sendai framework, you'll see a lot of that information in there as well. So in terms of planning, so things like state emergency management plans, you know, I was very fortunate to be part of the development of the second action plan. So, you know, it's better than it used to be when it comes to including our community. But the reality is that often decision makers don't necessarily fully consider us in their planning. I experienced that. I was at the National Preparedness Summit, and, you know, I don't have a visible disability, but it became very apparent when I'm talking with, you know, various state recovery authorities and commissioners that they hadn't thought about how we were going to cope in those situations. Part of that is that there's not a lot of data around how we are impacted. There's not a lot of work being done in that space, although that is improving. We also, when it comes to warnings and things like that, there's not sort of uniform accessibility of warnings and information that comes out. You know, we face, like many other at-risk cohorts, the digital divide. So we may not have access to technology that gets the messaging through. We may not have access to, you know, the internet and things like that. It may not be readable, the format that it comes through in, you know, and in extreme situations where, you know, the infrastructure gets knocked out, we're kind of stuck. Again, another example is the Northern Rivers flooding. Some very good friends of mine who are deaf approached the emergency management folks and said, you know, can you please start disseminating this information in Auslan? And they said, that's a great idea. How about you get onto that? So that's pretty dangerous. And, you know, we, in terms of things like support, we require support before, during and after natural disasters. But what's not commonly talked about is we often require that support much earlier and much longer post an event. It takes us longer to recover from those events. And, you know, the Hurricane Katrina, there was a report done recently that 76% of the folks impacted with disability by that were never able to return home to their communities again. So we want to try and avoid that through these. And then, you know, some of the barriers too, we face things like social and economic risk factors. You know, when you are facing extreme poverty, and that's for many cohorts, it's very hard to prepare. It's very hard to stockpile. It's very hard to double your medication that you have in your home if you're struggling just to afford what you've got. Many at-risk cohorts face things like housing instability, and they can't get around. It costs money to get around in taxis and things like that. So, you know, things like social isolation are huge barriers to people's preparedness. So I'd encourage you to think about that when you're thinking about your projects. Next slide, thank you. But some good news. Some really good news. Anyone from emergency management that's listening? You know, we are already navigating complex systems and infrastructure and networks that are not designed to include us. What does that mean for you? It means we understand how to think in agile, flexible, creative ways. So you can use that as an asset. The other really good news, particularly if you're thinking about, you know, in building community connection in your community, is that there are many of us who are actually really actively looking to become involved in their community, and that does include volunteering. Many of us are, you know, for all of the reasons that I've outlined, heavily invested in wanting to be part of your decision-making processes, in designing the projects that you are thinking about applying for and implementing. You know, at a time when you know, like lots of people, Volunteering Australia, etc., are talking about the fact that volunteering is in decline, we are an untapped resource. We are, you know, with a little bit of creative thinking, we are here, we're waiting, and we want to be involved, and we want to volunteer, and we want to be part of these solutions. The quote that you see there is from a very dear friend of mine, and they sort of have said, you know, I know who is who in my community. You know, I know where they are. I know how to find them, and I can be part of that solution. But most importantly, I actually want to be. And that's very powerful. So, you know, people talk about the fact that, you know, we're not engaged or they don't know where to find us. Well, you know, it doesn't take much, and it can just be a little bit of creative thinking, and we desperately want to be part of the solutions, particularly in areas that, you know, might mean the difference between us making it and not. So, you know, please, if you're building a project and you're thinking about, oh, I don't know how I'm going to get the community involved, and, you know, everybody's so busy and cost of living pressures, people are working more, etc., there's a whole untapped resource of really agile, really creative, and really committed individuals that you can access. Thanks. All right. So another piece of good news is around accessibility. I do spend a significant time talking about this, funnily enough. Good news, if you are looking at things like building back better, if you start with building things, you know, projects, solutions, infrastructure, hardware, whatever it is, you make it accessible for us, you actually then make it accessible for pretty much everybody in your community. And I went through and gave some examples here. So not a lot of people know some of these facts, but SMS that we all rely on inherently actually was invented for people who are deaf to communicate using mobile phones, and it's now part of our everyday life. Automatic doors, you know, really great for those of us with mobility issues, or, you know, things around strength and stuff like that. It'll actually save you money on your energy costs. Same with audiobooks. Now, I didn't realise, but audiobooks were built in the 1930s, and they were invented for people with vision impairment. And I reckon most of you have sat and listened to an audiobook in your life and thought how cool that is. Well, that's, you know, that's another example of, you know, of that solution coming in and being part of everyday life, and you can do that too. And the last one was a bit of a cheeky thing because we're on Zoom, so I said Zoom anyone. So what Zoom is actually, it was not invented for folks with disability, but what it actually has done is open up people who have limited mobility, that maybe don't have all of the support that they need, that don't have the ability to leave home for various reasons, has actually meant now that they can be connected to you and they can contribute. You know, a person who can access Zoom and be part of conversations, can help you do research, can contribute to the design of your projects from their home if that's what they need to do. So, you know, there's lots of ways that, you know, things have been invented for us that become part of normal life, but lots of ways that we can be connected and involved in your work. So please consider that. So where are we going to go to from here? Well, this is my hope, I guess. I put down, you know, some things that I thought that, you know, if I was in charge of the money, Leila, that I would love to see. So, and, you know, this actually does apply. I mean, I've used the lens of disability because obviously that's the space I spend most of my time in, but, you know, it goes to every cohort that you can think of: First Nations, people living remotely, the elderly, the isolated, homeless folks, all of that. Include us at all levels of the planning and the evaluation, post-event, post-project, whatever that might be. Have a really good look at things like vulnerability assessments of the health of your community facilities. Involve us in that. You know, if you're thinking about the built environment, make sure that things that you're building or that you're preparing are actually then fully accessible to us, and things like battery backups and power backups that we can get to easily. Is there spaces that folks with sensory needs can, you know, access, or what have you got in place for them? Because as much as I spend a lot of my time invested in pre-planning and making sure that people don't have to get to evacuation centres, and, you know, you can use this for those as well, but we might have to sometimes, particularly when there's a sudden issue. So, you know, if you're thinking about either building back better or you know, preparing your centres or infrastructure, think about those things as well. Great news. As I've said, we're happy to partner. You know, there are many peak bodies, including People with Disability Australia that I represent, you know, but even locally, who are interested in partnering with you and supporting you to develop support systems, to develop advocacy, to develop preparedness, to develop responses. You know, we are here, and, you know, we're not actually that hard to find, particularly me, I'm quite noisy and loud. Very loud clothes usually, but so, you know, think about partnering with us. We're very interested in doing that. And then, you know, if you are thinking about things around information sharing, education programs, again, partner with us, because we have obviously inherent understanding about those communities and who might be your key players in those communities, because it's not always the top of the pile who is the person who's going to be most impactful for you to partner with. So, you know, think about those programs. If you think about you know, making them as accessible as possible, you're going to reach a whole heap of people that, you know, you might have missed, which ultimately leads to the goals that we're all trying to achieve. Yeah, I do encourage, and, you know, you're probably hopefully hearing it in my voice, but I really do hope that you consider involving us in the solutions. It's an invitation, I suppose, from me to you to I guess, change the mindset from us being a problem that needs to be solved to us being a tool in your toolbox, you know, in working on those solutions. We can be an asset to all of the work that you do. So, yeah, thank you very much. And I'll open it up in case there's any questions. That's how you can find me. If you're interested, but also through the ladies here at WACOS, because I do work with them on a couple of projects as well. But yeah, I'm open to questions if there's anything. Otherwise, I will let you get onto it.
Great. So, thank you so much, Claire. That was really useful.
Yeah, no problems. I could talk all day long, but I won't. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, well, we'll move on to, so now is question time, so that was perfect. Great segue. Because I'm selfish and leading this, I'll start off with a question from us, and then we'll move on to the chat. And if you want to raise your hand, you also can. Yeah, just to jump back, I think something that also just to acknowledge as well that we here at WACOS right now are running a project that's through NDRR funding, which is similar to DRF in that it's run through CMIC, but slightly different. And we just did want to acknowledge that the co-contributions and the in-kind contributions are a part of this that can be quite complex. And so just to think about that as you're preparing your application, and to think about how you are also going to document that and work with other departments, et cetera, to make sure that that's fulfilled. And so then just a question for you all at CMEC is, how do you recommend sort of addressing in-kind contributions and thinking about that in advance, and also making sure that that acquittal process, because obviously that can be quite complex and different to what sometimes community sectors are used to. And so can you talk us through a little bit of that, how we're documenting in kind as well? I don't know, Matt, I think you're there. Cameras off. Great, thanks.
There we go. Yeah, no, the in-kind stuff can be quite tricky to count, but I think it's important that you do need to have a look at your contributions. Sorry, my chair's just falling apart behind me, and I've just realised the back's about to fall off it. No, yeah, it's important to count and make sure that you do take into consideration all the time that's in there. So it's not just the cash component. In fact, we very rarely see cash contributions. So don't just think about your own time working on it, but also that of your project partners as well. Which is why if you do look at partnership models, particularly in the delivery of projects, getting over that 50% hurdle for co-contributions, it makes it a lot more achievable. And I do also just note the work that WACOS has done in that previous applications for both the food security and the heat projects which you're conducting, and your experience in managing that co-contribution requirement as well. But I think the key thing with the co-contributions is to ask questions and talk to us about them, because quite often as well there's opportunities where we can bring people into the fold that can help achieve that as well. So it's not just all about cash, and it's not just all about your time. There's a lot of people within the community services sector, but also state government who might be able to contribute as well.
Yeah.
And just following on from that, Carol, I get it. It's like an elephant in the room, right? Because we're told your in-kind contribution can be funds the agency invested in the program before the application. But how broad is that, right? So perhaps you've just got a whole new upgrade to an ICT system, and it's that upgrade that's enabling you to be able to go forward with a DRF application. Is that going to contribute to your in-kind? Because there's obviously going to be obvious yeses, yes, elders participating or the other peak bottles participating, but then there's going to be blurry space. And what we haven't been given is a very clear frame or scope around in-kind. But what we, in recognition of that, what Matt and I are doing based on our experience across different sectors is pulling in some examples. We're going to put it in black and white. We're going to take it to NEMA and we're going to ask them, okay, what's in, what's out? Because we want to be able to come back and say, here is a concrete list of in-kind contributions. However, that being said, we don't know how that process is going to unfold, and we don't want to raise expectations that can't be met, considering it's a national or a Commonwealth government's call on what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I think one of those other grey areas there, and you've mentioned around systems and process before, is also intellectual property. Is I've seen some grants get up where previously generated intellectual property has been given a value by the applicant and it's been accepted. I've seen other examples where it hasn't. But I think when you look at the collective knowledge of everyone in this room and the level of work that everyone's previously done in the sector, there's probably a fair amount of IP sitting around which would enable them to drive these projects forward, but may not necessarily be provided free of charge. So we'll get clarity on that. We will report back if we hear back from NEMA. But I think a better rules around that 50-50 would go a long way to getting clarity around what can and can't be included.
But the double-edged sword of that is that it could also like shoot us in the foot, because rules are rules. You know what I mean? So we're in this double bind here where in a way we have the flexibility to get creative in terms of that co-contribution because that clear policy isn't there. However, the double edge of that is that it can be really challenging to then come up with it. I really think that in your EOI process, go through and put some creative ideas in there. And then what we can do is we can work through them.
Great. Yeah, and I might pause us there. Thank you so much for that. We do only have about 5 minutes for questions left now. So I'll pass it on to Colleen to go ahead and then, yeah, keep sending your questions through.
Thank you. I had a question obviously about family and domestic violence, being from Stopping Family Violence, a peak body and perpetrator response. So obviously there's a lot around mental health and well-being through recovery, which is super, super important. But I didn't see anything around family and domestic violence. We know family and domestic violence increases in the wake of natural disasters quite significantly, and obviously disproportionately affects Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. Is there some context that I'm missing there, or is it not there because it's covered somewhere else, or it seems like a bit of an oversight. I'm just curious if there's more information there.
Oh, I mean, the reality is that what we presented today is oversight. There's a lot of oversight across a lot of really important issues. I think, and I'm confident that across my last 4 years in this sector, that I have found a lot of evidence around the disaster events having driven a higher risk of FTV. So I'm confident that the data is there. Whether reducing FDV risks due to a hazard or in emergency management is a distinct priority, I don't know that, and maybe it isn't, but that's broadly because, like I said, we're only just now actually focusing on the social risks. So when I wrote your name and organisation down, because I'd be really keen to have a chat with you about what a project might look like, and believe that the data would be there for a solid project application.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions? Well, if we don't have any other, I might just one quick question of just, you talked about, evidence of engagement, and I think especially for the community sector, that's really relevant. What's a way in which we can really make sure that there's clear evidence of engagement and make sure that that's something that is presentable? I think that could be tricky in spaces where they expect quantifiable results, and that's not always what this sector is capable of. So I just wanted to tag that as well as something to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, sorry, there was an echo. I think that the strongest applications are going to have partners with those impacted communities, much like what Claire was talking about, where you have the applicant, for example, is WACOS. Let's make a scenario up, and it is focused on supporting rough sleepers to prepare for hazard events. Then what you would have is an appropriate representative or lived experience group who you were able to say, we came up with this together, and that would be that, if you had to add the evidence, it would be that here's a meeting agenda with the attendees of those representatives. That being said, I'm not, 100% sure what level of detail and evidence they would be looking for. I just know that from what I've seen, they're going to be looking for that engagement if your application is on behalf of a particular community. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. Great. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So thank you for answering all of those. I think if you do have any questions going on the rest of this time, please feel free to pop them into the chat. And we won't have another question period, but we'll come back to this, and this will be recorded. And so we from WACOS are happy to reach out to you and or send on any of your details to any of the participants today. So yes, thank you all so much. We're now going to move on to Tara Whitney, who will be presenting. Tara is the director of Whitney Consulting, who will be liaising with applicants for this grant round. And so we're really excited to welcome her as well. She and her team have helped with applications for over $100 million worth of funding in the past 6 years. And they have much expertise to offer. So I'll pass it on to her to talk about grant writing essentials.
Thank you. All right, can everyone see the screen all good?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. All right, yeah, so we're going to talk about grant writing essentials. So my name is Tara Whitney. I am from Whitney Consulting, which we founded just over 6 years ago. My background is in assessing grant applications. So I'm the person that was looking at it going, yes or no, you can have the money or not. Spent that about 7 or so years doing that for WA's biggest grant program, the Royalties for Regions. So having that background, obviously, I've seen a lot of good applications well, sorry, no, that's a lie. I've seen a lot of bad applications and I've seen a few good ones. So let's talk about how to increase the number of good ones that we have and decrease the bad ones. So I have never done this Grant Essentials workshop in under an hour before, so I'm going to talk quickly. If you have any questions, chuck them in the chat and I'll see if I can get to them at the end. And I can clarify at the end anyway. What I will talk about is, this is a general grant writing workshop about how to write any grant application. We don't have the actual application form as yet for DRF, but I will cover a few things there anyway. So grants. Grants are for specific projects with clear outcomes. So what that means is your project must have a beginning and an end, and it must have outcomes or deliverables that you're going to deliver. It is not for the ongoing running of your organisation. Funding bodies are the ones that provide grants, and you've got to remember when you're writing your application, why are they doing so? They are doing so because they are paying for the outcomes your project will deliver. There is something they are wanting to pay for. So you've got to look at what is it they are wanting to pay for, and that must be the focus of your entire grant application. This is not about you. This is not about the people that you guys work for. This is about the funding body when you're looking at your grant application. What do they want to pay for? And how can I show them that I'm going to give them what they're paying for? Because essentially they are investing. They're investment bankers investing in your project. They're paying for the outcomes. Another point to note about grants is generally, and in this case as well, they're generally not retrospective, which means you can't start doing your project until you find out that you have received the grant. The Disaster Ready Fund is competitive, meaning that you are competing against other applicants. So your project, your application needs to be better than theirs to get the funding. Grants vary in size and complexity quite a lot. So some are really simple, some are really complex. The thing that doesn't change is the grant writing approach, and that is what I'm going to go through with you today. The grant writing approach is the same no matter how much money you're going for, no matter how complex the application form, it's the same. What changes is the level of detail you're expected to put in there. Now, there is a lot of stuff you need to do before you actually start writing your grant application. You should not be leaving it until the grant application opens, because then you are going to be rushing your application and it won't be as good. What do you need to do before you start? The first thing that you need is you need to plan your project. You cannot start writing a grant application without having done the project planning first. It is exceptionally important. The best way of providing a grant application is to start out with a problem. When you plan your project, it should be developed around what is the problem I am solving. That is best practice, not the other way around, which is to go, this is something I think we need, here's a solution, and then start planning your project. So what I mean is, for example, if your problem that you've identified, you've seen that there's a problem in the fact that school-age kids perhaps don't understand how to be disaster ready. You see that as a problem and then go, right, what is the best way to solve this problem? And you brainstorm, you think about all the different options to solve the problem. Maybe we deliver a training package out to schools in certain disaster-prone areas. Maybe we get the kids to do a workshop where they create a disaster-ready action plan. Maybe we need to actually do a bit of a feasibility study into whether or not we should include disaster preparedness into the school curriculum. Coming up, brainstorming all these different ideas of what you could do, work out which project is going to solve the problem best, and then plan your project, not the other way around. When I say then plan your project, what that means is you need to work out exactly what you are doing and how you will do it. So if I gave you the money tomorrow, step by step, what would you do? Listing out your tasks. I would go and consult the schools. I would create a training package. What is it exactly you would do? And then think of each task and figure out the resources that are needed to deliver that task. The people, the dollars, the time required to do each of those tasks. That gives you the basis of a project plan. You now know exactly what you're doing, who will do it, how long it will take, and how much it will cost. And writing your grant will be a whole lot easier once you have that information. I have a project plan template, which will be sent out to you if it hasn't already, that you are able to use if you would like to plan your projects for this grant, for any other grants. It will help you to plan out your project in preparation for a grant application. So that project plan template is there for you. Now, the next thing that you need to do when you are preparing for a grant application is grab the guidelines. So as soon as they're released, get the guidelines, and you need to read them and know them inside out, absolutely thoroughly. You need to read them before you apply, and you need to read them before you press submit. With the guidelines, they are absolutely key, and there are so much in there that you need to go through. Go through and highlight all keywords or points. Now, what I mean when I say all keywords or points, anything that it tells you you must do. So it will say things like you must attach this, you must complete your project by this particular date. Anything it says about, file sizes and all of these things, anything like that is something you should be highlighting. The other thing that you need to highlight is it will always say in the grant guidelines the intended outcomes of the grant program, or the objectives of the grant program, or the aim of the grant program. Highlight those words, specifically the whole lot of it, highlight it all, because that is where the money is. If you cannot show them that your project is going to meet those intended outcomes of the grant, then you will not get the money. So highlight those, because we're going to use that wording in our grant application and repeat it back to them. These are all things you need to highlight before you start writing. It also talks about your eligibility. Check that before you start writing, because you don't want to apply for something that you are not eligible for. So go through and have a really good look. Very quick horror story. There was a grant program before COVID and then after. The grant program itself, the application didn't change before and after COVID. All that changed was the grant guidelines. Into the grant guidelines, they inserted a statement which said, to be eligible, you must attach a COVID safe plan. Didn't say anything about a COVID safe plan in the application form itself, but so because of that, so many people did not attach a COVID safe plan and they just weren't eligible. So immediately they were rejected. So please don't underestimate the importance of the grant guidelines and knowing them inside out. The next thing that you need to do before you start is gather your evidence and attachments. One key thing that you need to know about writing any grant application is you must evidence all your claims. Anything you are claiming, you should try to evidence. So you might claim that your particular target cohort needs something or has a particular, there's a lot of something happening within this particular target cohort. You can't just claim that, you have to evidence it with statistics. You might claim that your project is going to cost $500,000 to deliver. You can't claim that. You need to actually attach quotes or provide evidence. So when you are claiming anything in your grant application, you need to evidence your claims. To do that, you need to gather it. You need to get cost estimates. You need to do some research statistics, get some publications, photos. If you claim that somebody's putting some money in or putting some in-kind in, you need a commitment letter from them to prove it. Support letters, all of that sort of stuff you need to go and gather. You also will need a bunch of boring things like your incorporation certificate and organisation details. So have them ready to go before you start applying. So this is all stuff you need to do before you start your application, and it will stand you in good stead when you actually go to start writing. Just quickly, every grant has two sets of criteria. The first is eligibility criteria. That is a yes, no. Don't try to argue your eligibility because they just won't read the application. Yes, no, you're eligible or you're not. Make sure you check all of that. Generally, it's related to the type of entity you are. Be careful if you're a trust or a partnership, because they're often dodgy and not dodgy. They're not dodgy. Grants don't like them and don't want to fund them. So you need to be careful. The type of project you're delivering and the location are key points for eligibility, but please check that before you apply. The second set of criteria that every grant has is what's called assessment or selection criteria. Sometimes these criteria are clearly marked, they'll say assessment criteria. Sometimes they're just part of the big overall application. These are the ones that are scored, the assessment criteria. So these are the ones that you get scored against, and these are the ones that they compare you against every other grant application. With your assessment criteria or selection criteria, please be aware that you should be doing SAO answers or STAR answers, however you want to call it, and not motherhood statements. What that means is you cannot say, generally every grant will ask you about your organisational capability. So you can't say, we are an exceptionally capable organisation, we are a wonderful organisation. That is a motherhood statement. It gives no substance. There is nothing that I can score you as an assessor by you saying that. You need to evidence it. So to do that, you use situation, action, outcome, or situation, task, action, results, so SAO or STAR answers, to give examples, because assessors look for proof or evidence, and example answers give them that, especially if you're not able to attach something. So for example, instead of saying we are a great organisation, you should say such and such an organisation has delivered similar projects to this one in the past, including in 2017, we delivered such and such a project to a value of X dollars, and this was the outcome of doing that project. This is an answer that is a SAO answer. It gives me an example, it gives me evidence. That is how we are to answer assessment or selection criteria. Every single question should be answered in that way, not in a, we're great, we're definitely going to do this project really well, you can trust us. Because I don't trust you as an assessor, I'm giving you money. I'm an investment banker. I don't trust anyone with my money. I want to make sure that they are going to do it. So I need the evidence. So please make sure that you're doing SAO or STAR answers in your grant applications. Now, as I alluded to, the grant writing approach we'll quickly cover. Every grant is different. You know, obviously, the more amount of money you're going for, generally, the more information and more detail you are required to put in. But all assessors are looking for the same two things, regardless. That is, they are looking for a project that meets its objectives. So you need to show them how you are going to give them what they are paying for. The second thing they're looking for is they are looking for to make sure that you are not going to waste their money. So they're looking for a project that is professionally planned and managed and an organisation that is capable. They need to know you're not going to waste their money. So when you are, when you are looking at those two key areas, to give them, the assessor, the understanding that you are going to give them what you're paying for, we do this by matching the project results, the project deliverables, the outcomes, whatever it is you're going to achieve with your project, to the grant program's objectives. So as I said in the guidelines, we've already highlighted what these objectives or these intended outcomes are. So when we are writing our application, we make it so clear for the assessor that our project is going to meet it. So we do that by using their language. I call it beating them over the head with it. Make sure they cannot miss it. So repeat their language back to them. So for example, DRF criteria usually, in the past round anyway, it includes a question asking you to detail how the project meets the program objectives. So to answer this, you need to use the wording of the program objectives. So for example, the objectives of the DRF are to, and this is what they said in the last one, increase understanding of natural hazards, disaster risks and disaster impacts to improve disaster response and mitigate future hazard impacts, reduce community exposure to natural hazards and the creation of new risks, reduce the risks and harm associated with natural hazards, including reducing the recovery burden for governments and affected communities. So if we are doing a project to create and implement tools and resources to assist the community services sector to be more resilient to natural hazards, for example. So this is our project. We would say this project will, use their wording, increase understanding of natural hazards and the community services sector ability to mitigate their impacts by creating and implementing tools to assist the sector to be more resilient to natural hazards. By doing so, it aims to reduce community exposure to natural hazards by ensuring the sector that services the community is better prepared to both mitigate impacts and to respond to disasters. So you can see here how I've used their language and explained using their language how this project will deliver the outcomes that they are paying for. So that is one of the key areas we need our grant application to cover. The next is obviously, as I said, prove you're not going to waste their money. You're not going to blow it. Now that means that you are capable, that you have all of your governance in place, that you are able to deliver this project. You've got enough money to do it. You've got all the in-kind resources, etc. So we'll talk about that more as we go through. I do note the way to address these two key areas throughout your application is that you've got to cover the key project questions that we're about to go through. Key project questions are why, what, how, when, viability and cost. These all need to be covered somewhere in your grant application, but there is a balance. If you ask 100 grants assessors what is the main reason a grant application fails, 100 out of 100 will answer they didn't answer the question. It sounds stupid, I understand that, but it is exactly what every single grants assessor will tell you. People don't answer the question that is asked. They tell the assessors what they think the assessors want to hear, or they tell them what they want to tell the assessor about their project. So you really need to ensure that you answer the actual question that is asked, and you also give them the answer to these 6 key project questions. So first off, answer the question that's asked and then make sure you've answered these key project questions. To help you with that, I do have a grant application checklist that will be sent to you as well with the project plan, so that basically you can go through, you can write your answers, you can answer the actual question, and then you can check the checklist to make sure that you've also covered these 6 key project questions, which will make sure that you have a comprehensive quality grant application. So the questions, why? If chats are coming, I will come back and look at those later. Why? So why, the question about why is about the need for the project. If your project isn't needed, you won't get the money. So why links to your problem. When you first started thinking about the project, what problem were you solving? So for example, community services sector may have a lack of capability to prepare for and deal with natural disasters. I'm not bagging out the sector, I'm just saying I don't have a specific piece of it in mind. So we need to explore that problem. We do that by asking why over and over and over again. Why is this a problem? Because the sector delivers a bulk of services to the community in the event of a natural disaster. And if they're not able to effectively do so, efficiently do so without the appropriate tools, this is a problem. Why is this a problem? Because some tasks might be forgotten, or some tasks might take too long to be delivered, or we might not be able to access as large a portion of the community. Why is that a problem? You can see we're asking why over and over again. Why is that a problem if things take too long or get forgotten? Because people could die, people could get hurt, people could suffer. Why is that a problem? Because that costs government money, and it is counter to government's mandate. Government is paying for this outcome. They are paying to save themselves money, to make themselves money, or to meet their mandate, which is to make sure that the community is happy and healthy. So government pays for this, so we need to link our grant application to this by asking why over and over all the way to the end point. So when you are asking why, you're brainstorming by asking yourself 2 questions. What is the problem? Why is there a need for this project? What is the problem? What is the current situation? Why do we have a problem here? And what will the benefits of the project be? What are we going to deliver with this? What benefits are we going to deliver? You need your application to focus on all of these amazing things. Why is the project needed? Because if it's not needed, you won't get the money. So that's the first of the key project questions. And you need to evidence it. As I said, you need to evidence all your claims. So if you're saying that your project is needed because such and such a sector doesn't have something, you need to prove that it doesn't have it with facts, with quotes, with reports, publications, referencing those. The next of the key project questions is what? What is about exactly what will you do? Now, it sounds very simple, but the amount of times as an assessor that I have had to go all the way to the budget to figure out what actually this person was going to deliver, what they were actually going to do, is far too many to count. Because people get caught up in the emotions and the benefits. They're talking about how wonderful their project is and how many amazing benefits it's going to deliver, and often can forget to actually say, this is exactly what we will do. What I mean is, start it with this project will. This project will engage an external consultant to conduct a feasibility study into X, Y, and Z. This project will build such and such a facility. This project will do a review into exactly what will your project do. Make sure you go very clearly, this is what it will do. And answer any obvious questions. So for example, if you're saying that this project will deliver a training package, an obvious question is who to? You know, who is the training package going to be delivered to? Over what time period is the training package going to be delivered? All of this is part of your project description. I need to understand exactly what you are doing so that I can understand how that relates to what I'm paying for as an assessor. The next of the key project questions is how. Now, this is made up of a couple of components. Now, this is about how you will deliver your project. So first of all, who's going to manage the project? Is it going to be done in stages? Who's going to manage it? Remembering that we need to tell our assessors that we are a capable organisation. So if you tell me that the project's going to be managed by Joe, I need to know that Joe is a capable project manager. So what is their experience? What are their qualifications? How many projects? Or give me some examples of some projects they have managed. So who will deliver? Who will project manage it? How will they do it? How will you purchase anything that you're going to purchase? We are giving you money, so you are obviously going to spend the money. And as government, I need to know that you are going to spend it and get value for money. It's got to be transparent for government. So I need to know that you are not going to take the money and spend $50,000 on something because you're going to pay your brother to do the work, when actually it should have been a $10,000 piece of work. So in your procurement, you need to explain to me how you are going to procure. Do you have a policy in place, which means that you get 3 written quotes for anything over a certain amount? Do you have legislation that you must comply with in terms of procurement? How will you purchase, and how can we make sure that that is clearly transparent and value for money? The next part of how is governance. So you've got a project manager, that's great, but who's checking on them? Who is overseeing them? Who is making sure that they deliver the project to budget, to scope, and on time? Because this is all goes to your capability and prove that you're not going to waste their money. So is there a CEO? Is there a board, a committee? If so, who's on that committee? What's their experience, their expertise? Is there a working group that feeds into it? Who is overseeing the project decisions? How often do they meet? How is the project reporting being done? Are you doing a written project status update once a fortnight? How is this all happening to make sure that there is governance in place and you are absolutely going to deliver this project the way you have said? Because it is no point having an amazing project that meets their objectives if you can't deliver the project, if you can't actually do it. So they need, and they will look for, as an assessor, your ability to actually deliver the project you've said you're going to. The next of the key project questions is when. So this is obviously about the timeframes and the milestones. Now, I do note that in the last DRF, it only asked for project duration, so, beginning and end. However, they also look at whether or not you've got good planning, and there is an assessment criteria that asks about that and goes to the likelihood of success. So if you include a Gantt chart attachment or something about your project in terms of the milestones, Gantt chart, a table even, which lists the key milestones and when they'll be completed, it goes to show that you have planned your project out really well. You know exactly what you're going to do. It tells the assessor exactly what you're going to do and how long it's going to take. And it enables them to see and go, yes, there is clearly enough time in this time frame for them to get that done. So I can see that this is a viable project, they're able to do it. When you are doing your timeframes and milestones, don't forget that it takes them time to assess the grant. So don't say you're going to start your project a day after the application closes. It's going to take government at least 3 months. If they can get it done in 3 months, I'm surprised. At least 3 months before they are going to get back to you. The way I'd like to do it is I will put a date in where I will say, 1st of July 2023, funding announced or funding approved or funding agreement signed or something like that. So that then they can see, well, if the funding agreement isn't signed by this date, obviously all the other timeframes are going to be pushed back as well. When you are doing your timeframes, make them specific dates like that. So 30th of June 2023, don't say 1 month or 2 months. This is how long it's going to take. Because we don't know then what is going to happen consecutively or concurrently. So make it specific dates and specific activities like commence construction, complete construction, not just construction, because we don't know what you're doing. So make them specific dates and specific activities and don't have any unexplained gaps. So if you've done your project planning, this should be really easy because you've gone through and you've listed your tasks and you've also listed how long each of those tasks are going to take. The next of the key project questions is viability. So again, this has got a few little components that make it up. This is all about, is your project going to be able to be completed and completed successfully? The first thing here is stakeholder engagement. So there will be people that you need to help you do your project. And if they are not on board, then your project isn't viable. So if, for example, you need to use your local government oval to do your project and you don't have a letter of support from the local government saying that they are willing to let you use the oval, all the local government has to do is say no, and your project is dead in the water. It's not viable anymore. So as an assessor, if I can see that you're relying on anyone, you need somebody to do your project, then I need a letter of commitment from them. I need a letter of support showing that they are on board. So this means if anyone's providing any funding or any in-kind support, you need a letter of support from them, a letter of commitment that actually says, we will provide $50,000 or we will provide this kind of in-kind support. Because if you claim that they're going to give you this in-kind support, but you haven't evidenced your claim, then you haven't done that essential part of grant writing, which is to evidence all of your claims. So stakeholder engagement is really important. The other reason it's important is because you need to show that your project is needed. Under the why, we've said you need to show your project is needed. So you need to show that the people who will benefit from your project actually will use your project or will actually benefit from it. So if you've said you're doing this whole project for a certain group of people and that group of people don't want or need what it is you're going to do, they're obviously not going to benefit from it, which means you're not going to deliver any outcomes, which means the funding body is not going to get what they are paying for. So when you are doing your stakeholder consultation, you need to ask yourself 2 questions. Who do I need to make sure this project will work? Look at all your tasks, go through everything you're going to do. If you need any money, any resources, any approvals from anyone, you need to speak to them, make sure they are on board. The second question you need to ask yourself is who will benefit from or use the end product of the project? So if you're going to deliver it to a school, for example, are they actually going to use it? Do they commit to using this training package and delivering this training package, or are they just not going to do it? In which case your project is, again, dead in the water. It's not viable. So ask yourself those 2 questions when you're doing your stakeholder engagement. Now, when it comes to letters of support and letters of commitment are 2 different things. A letter of support says, I support your project. That's great. But if I have said in my application that you're giving me $50,000 for it, you saying you support my project does not give me the evidence that you're going to give me $50,000. You need a letter of commitment from anyone who has said they're giving anything, giving access to their land, giving money, giving in kind. You need the letter to specify exactly what they are giving. I commit to provide $50,000 to this specific project. So anyone you need a letter of commitment for, make sure it's really specific. Now with letters of support, they are very helpful. However, if you write up a template letter and then send it to a bunch of people and they all sign the same letter, it's not helpful at all. As an assessor, I would look at those letters and just completely discard them immediately, and I would give no value to them whatsoever. Because letters of support are supposed to be specific to the organisation that is writing them. Those letters should, the whole purpose of letters of support are for them to evidence that there is a problem. So you want them to prove that there's a problem that your project is going to solve. You want them to evidence that your project is going to solve the problem. You want them to evidence that people are going to benefit from it and how that people are going to benefit from it, and that you're a capable organisation. Now, each organisation will do that differently. So, for example, if I'm building a playground, so very simple, I'm building a playground. If I get a letter of support from the local playgroup, that's going to talk all about the kids and the fact that there's no playgrounds around and there's nothing for them to do, and therefore they're not developing their motor skills. It's going to be all around play and kids and parents, because it should, because that's their organisation. However, if I go and ask for a letter of support from WA Police, then realistically that letter is probably going to say something like, in this particular town, we have a serious youth crime problem because there's nothing to do in this town. Here are some statistics about the youth crime and how it's been increasing. We really strongly believe that this playground will help because it will give you something to do. Now, all of a sudden, you've got two very different reasons why different organisations want it. Whereas if you've given them a template, it's just like, yeah, we think this is a great project. Secondly, you've got from WA Police some statistics which you can use to evidence your need for your project. So you don't know what kind of gold is sitting in that organisation that they might be able to pull out and give to you in their letter of support if you just give them a boring template. So I highly encourage you to have a conversation with the people you're getting letters from, ask them to provide those things, to explain or evidence the problem, the fact your project will solve it, the fact you're a capable organisation, and that the benefits are wanted and needed. The next part is risk analysis. So DRF don't specifically ask for, or they didn't last time, specifically ask for a risk management plan. Some grants will have a table, some will ask for a framework. If you do happen to attach one, obviously it is going to further evidence your ability to deliver, and it will add to your capability assessment, because showing that you have considered the risks of your project and you will mitigate them obviously gives an assessor further safety and comfort that you have thought this through and you are capable of delivering this project. So I do encourage you to do it. When you are doing your risks, and I know that you guys are probably all over risk management, but when you are doing your risks, the one thing you need to remember is the thing that I've said about 10,000 times this workshop already: the funding body is paying for the outcomes of your project. So therefore, the risks to delivering the outcomes are what you should consider. You should not just be considering during project risks. Think about post-project risks. So for example, if you've thought just about this training program that we might be delivering to schools, one of the risks would be nobody shows up or nobody uses the training package we've developed. That is after the training package has been developed, it's after you've done your project, but it is a massive risk to delivering your outcomes. So please don't forget to focus on the risks to delivering your outcomes. If you have any leverage funds then that aren't secured, they should be included in your risk. What happens if you don't get them? The third part of viability is sustainability. So this is about the future funding of the program. It's about the ongoing benefits. It is relevant for all projects, but for some more than others. But essentially what it means is we don't want to fund something that is only temporarily beneficial. Even if you're writing a report, this is your project, you're getting funded to do some sort of a report. As an assessor, they want to know that those benefits are going to be ongoing. So they want to know that you're not just going to take that report and shove it in your top drawer. They want to know, and you need to tell them how it's going to be extended, that the information obtained by doing this report is going to be of value. It's going to be provided to all of these other organisations. It's going to be published here, extended here, and it's going to be valuable on an ongoing basis. It's obviously very relevant if you're doing anything to do with infrastructure, because infrastructure has maintenance costs, replacement costs, operational costs, and you need to show how they will be funded. Because when a grant program pays for a hospital, for example, they're not paying for the fact that there's a hospital sitting there. They're paying for what happens in that hospital day in, day out, the improved health outcomes. And if you can't afford to run the hospital, there's no point them giving you the grant to build one. So sustainability is something that you should consider as to how you are going to fund the asset or program in the future, how you are going to continue to deliver the benefits. That sustainability factor can be most complicating when you're talking about programs, and you're talking about programs that are being delivered to people who can't necessarily fund them themselves. So for example, if you're talking about creating a program, you obviously will only get funding through a grant for the delivery of that one program for, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years. Once that funding's finished, how are you going to continue on the program? That is something you need to consider. Are you going to do this program and get the grant funding to deliver the program, gather evidence while you're doing the program of how amazing this program is, and then when the grants run out, you're going to turn it into a fee for service where people pay to participate in the program, and you've got all these testimonials and evidence to show that they will benefit if they pay to do the program. If, however, the people that you are delivering the program to are never going to be able to afford to do the program, then what are you going to do? You can't just keep going back from grant after grant after grant. That is not how grants are designed. So are you going to perhaps build into your 3-year program funding and an assessment, an evaluation towards the end? So you do an evaluation, which means that you can then go back to government and say, here were the amazing results of this program. We think you should now put this into your budget permanently and deliver this program on an ongoing basis. So you've got to consider it. No matter what your project is, you've got to consider sustainability. The next of the key project questions, or the last of the key project questions, is cost. Now, this is obviously about your budget. You need to consider with your budget, again, we are claiming that it's going to cost this amount. The assessor will be looking at your budget and going, is that reasonable? Is that reasonable to do what you've said you're going to do? Do you have enough money, not too much money? So they need to have enough detail for them to do that. The best way to do your budget is to have each line item provided with some comments, some evidence. So, this line item, see attached quote, which obviously evidence it. This particular line item calculated based on 20 hours at $50 per hour. This is how much it's going to cost. Evidence how you have got to that figure for each of the line items in your budget. Please don't forget to include any cost of grant requirements if you're asked to do an independent financial audit, for example. Now, cash versus in kind, I'll quickly go through the difference between the two and how to understand the difference between the two. Cash, you've got to ask yourself 2 questions. Is it coming out of my bank account? And would I have spent the money if I wasn't doing the project? So if the money is coming out of your bank account and you wouldn't have spent the money if you weren't doing the project, then that is a cash contribution. Everything else is in kind. So to explain that using salaries, which are often the ones that people get tripped up with, if I have an employee who works 2 days a week, they're a permanent employee, they work 2 days a week, during the project, I'm going to transfer them onto the project and say, right, during your 2 days, I need you to work on this project, drop everything else you were doing. That is an in-kind contribution, because yes, I'm paying this person out of my bank account, but I would have to have paid them anyway. Even if I didn't do the project, I still had to pay them 2 days a week because they're a permanent employee. So what I am giving the project is a resource. I'm giving them an in-kind staff member. However, if this staff member is going to go and to work extra days, so they're going to continue doing their 2 days a week as they normally would, but during the life of the project, they're going to work 4 days. So they're going to do 2 extra days. Those 2 extra days that they're working during the life of the project is now a cash contribution, because you would not have paid them those extra 2 days if you weren't doing the project. So that's how to figure out cash versus in kind. I hope that is helpful. With your budget, if you have any leverage funding, please make sure somewhere in the application you explain the status of that. Now, what leverage funding means is this grant leveraging any other funding? So are you getting $50,000, for example, from some other source? And if you are, you need to include that and explain what is the status of it. So it's already secured, or we're going to find out the results next month, or what is the status of this leverage funding. Lastly, on cost, because I know I'm running out of time, contingency. Should you or should you not include a contingency amount? Check the guidelines. Ask the question if you're not sure. Contingency is very dependent on the type of project and the amount you're going for. If you are going, for example, for a few $1 million for an infrastructure project and you don't have contingency, then as an assessor, I will be very concerned about the viability of your project. If you're going for $5,000 and it's a very simple project and you've included 10% contingency, I'd be thinking, did you really need to do that? So it very much is varied. Some grants will allow you, some won't. The other factor is obviously the guidelines will explain to you about co-contributions and how much you have to contribute, whether you can contribute all of that in kind, or some of it has to be cash, or it all has to be cash. So check the guidelines and don't hesitate to contact the funding body. In this case, you would contact Matt and Leela, the team there. But for other grants, don't hesitate to contact the funding body, because they want to help you, and if you have questions, they will help you if they can. DRF specifically says you can include a contingency amount. So that is budgets. To summarise, this is what has been a whirlwind grant workshop that I normally take a lot longer to do. You must know your funding body's objectives. So you need to understand what is it they are paying for, what are they investing in, what are they trying to achieve, and align your project to it. You must plan your project out well. A couple of the things that you should be starting on ASAP, if you haven't already, is getting quotes and getting letters of support and letters of commitment, because those are two things that you've got no control over, how long it's going to take. If you ask for a quote and it takes you 2 weeks, it takes you 2 weeks. I would start now getting those things done. The point is, please remember to do STAR and SAO answers and not motherhood statements. What that means is you need to evidence everything you claim. So when you are answering questions, you need to give examples as opposed to just claiming something and saying, I am wonderful. I want you to evidence that you are wonderful. Give me your expertise, your qualifications, what you've done in the past. And address all key project questions that we have gone through. You need to do that to be able to have a comprehensive application. Please remember that grants assessors are like investment bankers. So if you think about, if somebody asks you, if your mate comes up to you and says, hey, I'm doing this cool thing, can I have $10,000? Think about some of the questions you would be asking them. Why do you need it? Can you prove that you actually need it? Can you prove that this project is going to actually deliver on what it's supposed to? What exactly are you going to do? When are you going to do it? When am I going to get my benefits? How are you going to do this? You would have a lot of questions, yeah? So a grants assessor is the same. They're an investment banker. They are paying for the outcomes. They want a return on their investment. So they need to know that you are going to deliver this project and deliver it really, really well. Now, final points. When submitting an application, please make sure the application's been prepared in the required format. Nowadays, that's usually an online portal. You will have word limits usually. Sometimes they're word limits, sometimes they're character limits. Make sure you check. Make sure you check the guidelines. Go back over and look at everything we highlighted. Make sure that you've complied with everything they've said in terms of file types and file size limits and all of that. Often there'll be in the guidelines ineligible budget items. Make sure you haven't included any of those. I then suggest always that you have someone read your application completely separate to the project, read your application and give you feedback, because you know your project so well. You assume knowledge and you can't help it. You will do it. So make sure you get somebody who doesn't know the project. You are very lucky in that DFS have done are offering you this service where we will do a grant review for you if DFS asks us to. So go through DFS, put your EOI in, because we are offering reviewing your grant application and giving some guidance. So that will help. But even if you don't get us to do it, I do encourage you to always, with all of your grant applications, have somebody review it before you submit it. Ask them to tell you anything they don't understand, any questions they had, or any areas they think could be strengthened. And if you don't get the money, why do they think you didn't get the money? Now, there is a grants checklist and a project plan template. So that will be provided to you later. As I said, the grant review service through DFES need to do the EOI, and then the team, Matt and Lila's team, will refer them across to me. So that is available for you. Now, I will stop sharing and check the chat. Any questions?
Thank you so much for that, Tara. That was really excellent, and just really wonderful to hear. All of your advice, I think, is really useful to both this and other processes, so thank you.
Thank you.
We do have time for probably one question. Does anybody have anything before we close off? Sorry, I realize that's a lot of pressure for one question, but well, feel free to, you can always reach out to us, and we can send you more details or reach out to anybody, and we're happy to pass on any questions that anybody does have. But thank you so much. That was really useful. And yes, we are now at the end of this webinar, so hopefully you gained some useful information for applying for grants generally, thinking about the disaster readiness space, and thinking about how this could be applicable to your organization as well. We will be sharing this recording on the WACOS website, and you will also receive the link to the recording in about a week or so. So feel free to pass that on to your networks. And yeah, anytime you're welcome to reach out to us as well if you do have any questions, or reach out to any of the presenters that you heard from today, including the team from CMAC. Matt, do you have anything to say before we close off?
Just thank you everyone for your attention today, and also thank you to WACOS for hosting. And I think the key message on our end is that we're here to help. So I did notice some commentary before about how these processes seem to favour the big organisations, and that's something that we're looking to equalise through the support that we're providing. So that support, we are primarily providing it for your community service organisations, your smaller not-for-profits, but also your regional and remote local governments as well. So we really want to help, and we really want to see some great projects get up for the community services sector.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, thanks to all of our presenters for your time and presentations and expertise. And thank you all for joining. Hope you have a lovely rest of your Friday and happy almost weekend. Bye, everyone.